Welcome to New American Mythos, where old stories are kindled like firelight, and we gather round to remember the tales that shaped us. Tonight, we travel up the Hudson River into the shadow of the Catskill Mountains, where the fog clings to pine branches and the winds roll through the trees like the tide. This is the legend of Rip Van Winkle, a man who slipped into the wilderness and out of time itself. First published in 1819 by Washington Irving under the pseudonym of Diedrich Knickerbocker, Rip's tale was among the earliest myths born on American soil. Yet, beneath its whimsy lies a quiet ache. What happens when a man forgets himself? When a nation forgets its roots? Rip Van Winkle is a myth about the price of forgetting and the perverse comfort of being forgotten. So settle in, let the evening mists rise in your mind's eye, and listen for the roll of distant thunder. Before we begin the story proper, you'll hear a short introduction written by Washington Irving himself. It's presented like a historical account, but it's actually part of the fiction, crafted to give the tale a sense of age and authenticity. Irving used this fictional preface to set the stage with a kind of scholarly authority, like he was just passing along an old tale. It's a clever move, especially for a story that's about to dive into the strange and supernatural. Introduction. The following tale was found among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker, an old gentleman of New York, who was very curious about the Dutch history of the province and the manners of the descendants of its earliest settlers. His historical research, however, did not rely so much on books as on people, for the former were sadly lacking on his favorite subject. Whereas he found the old burghers, which are people who lived in a town or borough, and even more so, their wives, rich in that legendary lore so invaluable to true history. Whenever, therefore, he came upon a genuine Dutch family snugly settled in its low-roofed farmhouse beneath a spreading sycamore tree, he looked upon it as a little volume of a black leather type, tightly bound, and studied it with the zeal of a bookworm. The result of all these researches was a history of the province during the reign of the Dutch governors, which he published some years ago. There have been various opinions about the literary character of his work, and to tell the truth, it is no better than it ought to be. Its greatest merit is its scrupulous accuracy, which, to be fair, was somewhat doubted when it first appeared, but has since been fully established. It is now included in all historical collections as a book of unquestionable authority. The old gentleman died shortly after the publication of his work, and now that he is dead and gone, it can do no more harm to his memory to say that his time might perhaps have been better spent on weightier matters. He was, however, inclined to pursue his interests in his own way. And though he occasionally kicked up a bit of dust in the eyes of his neighbors, and troubled the spirit of some friends for whom he held the greatest affection and respect, his errors and eccentricities are remembered, quote, more in sorrow than in anger, end quote. It's even begun to be suspected that he never meant to hurt or offend anyone. Whatever critics may think of his legacy, it is still fondly remembered by many whose good opinion is well worth having, particularly by certain biscuit bakers, who have even gone so far as to imprint his likeness on their New Year's cakes, thus giving him a chance at immortality nearly equal to that of being stamped on a Waterloo medal or a Queen Anne's farthing. So there it is. Irving used this fictional preface to set the stage with a kind of scholarly authority, like he was just passing along an old tale. It's a clever move, especially for a story that's about to dive into the strange and supernatural. Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. Part 1. Whoever has traveled up the Hudson River must remember the Catskill Mountains. They are a dismembered branch of the great Appalachian family, visible far to the west of the river, swelling to a noble height and ruling over the surrounding countryside. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed, every hour of the day, brings some new hue or shape to these magical mountains. They are regarded by all the goodwives, far and near, as perfect barometers. When the weather is fair and settled, they are clothed in blue and purple, boldly outlined against the evening sky. But sometimes, even when the rest of the landscape is cloudless, they gather a hood of gray mist about their summits, which, in the last rays of the setting sun, glows like a crown of glory. At the foot of these fairy mountains, a traveler may have noticed a wisp of smoke curling from a village, its shingled roofs gleaming among the trees, just where the blue of the uplands fades into the fresh green of the nearer fields. It is a small village of great antiquity, founded by Dutch colonists in the early days of the province, around the beginning of the rule of the good Peter Stuyvesant. May he rest in peace. Some of the original houses remained until a few years ago, built with small yellow bricks brought from Holland, their latticed windows and steep gables topped with weathercocks. In that same village, and in one of those very houses, which, truth be told, was sadly weather-beaten, lived many years ago, back when the country was still a British colony, a simple, good-natured fellow named Rip Van Winkle. He was descended from the Van Winkles who had figured gallantly in the chivalrous days of Peter Stuyvesant and had accompanied him to the siege of Fort Christina. Rip inherited, however, little of his ancestors' martial character. As I've said, he was a kind, simple soul, friendly to neighbors, and a compliant, long-suffering husband. In fact, this latter condition may explain the meekness of spirit that made him so universally liked. Men who live under the rule of a shrew at home are often the most obliging and conciliatory in public. Their tempers, no doubt, are made soft and flexible in the fiery furnace of domestic suffering, and a curtain lecture, which is being yelled at by one's wife, can teach patience better than any sermon. A shrewish wife may, in that sense, be considered something of a blessing, and if so, Rip Van Winkle was thrice blessed. He was greatly beloved by the village women, who, true to the gentle instincts of their sex, always took his side in domestic disputes, and, in their evening gossip, laid the blame squarely on Dame Van Winkle, which is Mrs. Van Winkle. The children of the village greeted him with delight. He joined in their games, made them toys, taught them how to fly kites and shoot marbles, and entertained them with long tales of ghosts and witches and Indians. Whenever he wandered through the village, he was trailed by a gang of children tugging at his coat, climbing on his back, and playing all sorts of tricks on him, with no fear of punishment. Not a single dog in the neighborhood would bark at him. The great flaw in Rip's character was a deep and unshakable aversion to all forms of profitable labor. This wasn't due to laziness. He could sit all day on a wet rock, fishing with a rod as long and heavy as a Tartar's lance, without complaint, even if he didn't catch a single fish. He would roam for hours through hills and swamps with his fowling piece, which was a hunting rifle, chasing squirrels or pigeons. He was always ready to help a neighbor, even with rough labor, and led all of the community frolics, such as husking corn and building stone fences. The village women employed him to run errands and do little tasks their husbands refused. In short, Rip was willing to do anyone's work, except his own. But when it came to tending his farm and family, he found it impossible. He claimed that farming his land was pointless. It was the most cursed patch of earth in the region. Nothing prospered. Fences constantly collapsed. His cow strayed or devoured the cabbages. Weeds flourished faster than crops. The rain always waited to fall just as he set about to do outdoor chores. Under his management, his small inheritance shrank until all that remained was a shabby plot of corn and potatoes. And even that was the worst in the neighborhood. His children, too, were ragged and wild, as if they had no parents. His son, young Rip, was a mirror image of his father, both in habits and, soon enough, in hand-me-down clothes. The boy was often seen trailing his mother, dressed in a pair of his father's old breeches, struggling to hold them up like a fine lady lifting her skirts in a storm. Rip Van Winkle was one of those happy souls, simple, mild, and content, who take the world as it comes, eat white bread or brown, whichever is easiest to obtain, and would sooner starve on a penny than work for a pound. Left to himself, he would have whistled away life in peace. But his wife was relentless, forever berating him for his laziness and the ruin he was bringing on his household. Morning, noon, and night she scolded. Every word he uttered, every move he made, triggered a fresh storm of household eloquence. Rip had only one method of response, and it became habitual. He shrugged, shook his head, looked heavenward, and said nothing. But this silence only stirred up more fury, until he would withdraw, beaten, to the outside of the house, the only domain, he felt, that belonged to a hen-pecked husband. Let's take a short break here. Notice, Rip is beloved, but broken, charming, but drifting. He does not rebel against the burdens of his life. He merely disappears from them. And isn't that a familiar temptation? To pull away from responsibility until the days blur and duty becomes a stranger? But here's the quiet truth. Without duty, Rip fades, not just from his family, but from himself. It is stewardship, even imperfect, that anchors our souls. Without it, we may still be kind, still be liked, but we risk becoming ghosts in our own time. Let's get back to the story. Rip's only domestic ally was his dog, Wolf, who was just as henpecked as his master. Dame Van Winkle saw them as partners in idleness, and even regarded Wolf with suspicion as the reason her husband was always wandering. Though Wolf was courageous in the woods, the moment he stepped into the house, his confidence vanished. His chest sank, his tail dropped between his legs, and he crept about with the guilty air of a culprit. At the mere motion of a broom or ladle, he would bolt for the door with a terrified yelp. As the years of marriage wore on, Rip's condition steadily declined. A sharp temper never softens with age, and a biting tongue is the only edged tool that grows sharper with constant use. For a long while, Rip consoled himself by joining a kind of permanent club of village sages, philosophers, and other idle fellows, who convened on a bench in front of a small inn. This inn was marked by a red-faced portrait of His Majesty, King George III. There they sat in the shade through long, lazy summer days, exchanging sleepy gossip and telling rambling tales about nothing. But occasionally, when a stray newspaper came through town, brought by a passing traveler, the group held deep and solemn debates. Derek Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, would read the contents aloud, undaunted by the longest and hardest words, and the assembled company would consider these months-old reports with great seriousness. The opinions of this junto were guided entirely by Nicholas Vedder, the village patriarch and innkeeper, who sat out front from morning to night, shifting his seat only to stay in the tree's shade. The townsfolk could tell the time by watching his movements, as if he were a human sundial. He rarely spoke, but was constantly smoking his pipe. His followers understood his moods well. When displeased, he puffed short, angry clouds. When content, he inhaled deeply and exhaled in slow, pleasant curls. On rare occasions, he would remove the pipe, let the smoke drift gently up his nose, and nod gravely to express full approval. But even in this retreat, poor Rip could not find peace. His shrew of a wife would burst upon the company, scolding them all, and even Nicholas Vedder was not spared her wrath. She accused him openly of encouraging Rip's idleness and uselessness. At last, Rip was driven almost to despair. His only refuge from his wife's scolding and the burdens of the farm was to shoulder his rifle and lose himself in the woods. There he would sit beneath a tree, sharing his small provisions with Wolf, who suffered under the same oppression.
"Poor Wolf," Rip would say, "thy mistress gives thee a dog's life, but never mind, lad, as long as I live, you'll have a friend."
Wolf would wag his tail and look up at Rip's face, and, if dogs can feel pity, he surely returned the sentiment with all his heart. Let's take another short break here. Here we find Rip and Wolf, two souls, quietly beaten down by the same storms. They do not lift one another. They do not challenge one another. They simply endure, side by side. It is a portrait of shared resignation, the kind of bond that forms when neither party expects much from the world anymore. There's a sadness in that, but also a warning. When our closest loyalties ask nothing of us, they may also lead us nowhere. For what happens when our closest bonds are with those who share our escape, not our calling? That's a haunting question for anyone tempted to drift away from their duties, or from time itself. Let's get back into the narrative. One fine autumn day, on one of those escapes, Rip had wandered farther than usual, climbing higher into the Catskill Mountains. He was pursuing his favorite pastime, squirrel hunting, and the stillness of the woods rang out with the occasional echo of his gun. Tired and panting, he rested on a green hillock near a cliff's edge, carpeted with mountain herbs. From a break in the trees, he gazed out across the lower valley. Far below, the lordly Hudson River flowed in majestic silence, reflecting the purple clouds and the sails of lazy boats that glided like ghosts across its surface, finally vanishing into the hazy blue of the distant highlands. On the other side, he looked down into a deep mountain glen, wild, lonely, and rugged, filled with boulders fallen from the cliffs above, barely lit by the slanting rays of the setting sun. Rip lay there, musing for a time. Evening was coming on. The mountains were casting long blue shadows over the valleys. It would be dark well before he could return to the village, and the thought of facing Dame Van Winkle brought a heavy sigh. Just as he prepared to descend, a voice rang out from the distance. "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" He turned, but saw nothing, only a lonely crow flapping across the mountain. Dismissing it as his imagination, he began to descend when the cry came again. "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" At the same moment, Wolf's back bristled and he gave a low growl, retreating nervously to Rip's side. Rip peered into the glen and saw a strange figure slowly making his way up the rocks, bent under the weight of something he carried on his back. It was odd to meet anyone in such a remote spot, but thinking the man might need help, Rip hurried down to assist him. As he neared, Rip was struck by the man's peculiar appearance. He was a short, broad-shouldered old fellow with thick, bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His clothes were of an antique Dutch style, a jerkin, which was like a vest, strapped at the waist, layers of breeches, which were pants, his outer pair oversized and adorned with rows of buttons and bunches at the knees. On his shoulder he carried a stout keg, seemingly full of liquor, and he motioned for Rip to come and help him. Though wary, Rip obeyed, and together they carried the load up a steep, rocky gully, apparently the dried bed of a mountain stream. As they climbed, Rip heard low, rumbling sounds like distant thunder, seeming to come from a cleft in the rocks toward which their rough path led. He paused for a moment, but thinking it was just one of those sudden thunderclaps common in the mountains, he continued on. At last they reached a hollow shaped like a small amphitheater, encircled by sheer cliffs with trees overhanging their edges. Only fragments of sky and clouds could be seen overhead. Throughout the climb, neither man had spoken, though Rip was puzzled by the mysterious keg and the silence of his companion. There was something uncanny about the man that checked all curiosity. In the center of the hollow stood a group of odd-looking men playing at ninepins, which was a kind of outdoor bowling. Their clothing also was outlandish: short doublets, jerkins, long knives at their belts, and most of them wore enormous breeches like the one Rip's guide had worn. Their faces were also unusual. One had a broad face with piggish eyes and a large beard. Another's nose took up nearly his entire face and was topped by a sugarloaf hat with a red cock's feather. All of them had beards of varying colors and styles. One man, who seemed the leader, was a stout old gentleman with a weather-beaten face. He wore a laced doublet, broad belt, and sword, a tall hat with a plume, red stockings, and high-heeled shoes with rosettes. The group reminded Rip of the figures in a Flemish painting that hung in Dominie van Schaik's parlor, a relic that had been brought from Holland during the original settlement. What struck Rip as particularly strange was that though the men seemed engaged in merriment, they kept grave, silent expressions on their face, and carried about their play with a solemn air. Nothing disturbed the stillness of the hollow except the sound of the bowling balls, which echoed through the mountains like distant thunder. As Rip and his companion approached the silent bowlers, the men abruptly ceased their game and fixed their eyes upon him with a stare so cold and statue-like that Rip's heart sank within him and his knees knocked together. The man with the keg now began to pour its contents into large flagons and gestured for Rip to serve the company. Trembling, he obeyed. The group drank in solemn silence, then returned to their game. Gradually, Rip's fear and awe faded. Seeing that no one took much notice of him, he even dared, when no eyes were on him, to taste the beverage. It had the flavor of excellent Hollands, a strong Dutch gin. Rip, being a naturally thirsty soul, was soon tempted to take another sip. One taste led to another and another still, until his senses were dulled, his head swam, and at last it nodded forward, and he sank into a deep sleep. Let's step back here again. This glen in the mountains is more than a strange place. It is a threshold between worlds and between selves. Rip enters with dread in his heart and drinks from a flagon that promises no judgment, no noise, no memory, only stillness. It is a subtle temptation, not evil, but empty, the kind of stillness that asks nothing of you and returns nothing in kind. In the Christian tradition, sloth is not just laziness. It is a forgetfulness of the soul, a drifting away from the name you were given. Rip drinks to forget, and wakes to a world that has forgotten him. Let's finish the episode now. When Rip awoke, he was once more on the green knoll from which he had first glimpsed the old man in the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright morning. The birds chirped in the bushes, and an eagle circled overhead in the fresh morning air.
Surely, Rip thought, I haven't slept here all night.
He tried to piece together the memories, the mysterious man, the keg, the amphitheater, the ghostly bowlers, the flagon.
Oh, that flagon! That wicked flagon! He groaned. What excuse can I make to Dame Van Winkle?
Looking around for his gun, he found instead a rusty old firelock, the barrel encrusted with rust, the lock falling off, the wooden stock riddled with wormholes. He suspected that the silent merrymakers had drugged him and stolen his good rifle. Wolf, too, was missing. Perhaps he'd gone off after a squirrel, but Rip's calls and whistles echoed unanswered across the glen. There was no sign of the dog. Determined to confront his strange hosts, Rip tried to find the path back to the amphitheater, but his body felt stiff and his movements were slow and painful.
These mountain beds don't agree with me, he muttered, and if I end up with rheumatism, I'll have a fine time of it with Dame Van Winkle.
With some effort, Rip descended into the glen and located the dry gully up which he and his companion had climbed the previous evening. To his astonishment, a mountain stream now tumbled through it, leaping from rock to rock and babbling with crystal chatter. Still, he scrambled up its edge, clambering through birch and sassafras, sometimes tripping over witch hazel roots or the tangled coils of wild grapevines that wove a net from tree to tree. At length he reached the cleft in the rock where the amphitheater had been, but there was no trace of it. The place was sealed by an unbroken wall of stone. Over its height, the stream now poured in a foamy sheet into a dark pool below, shadowed by the forest canopy. Rip stood, bewildered. He whistled and called again for Wolf, but was answered only by the cawing of crows high in the air, wheeling above a dead tree perched at the edge of a sunlit cliff. The birds, secure in their height, seemed to laugh at his confusion. What was to be done? The morning was passing away, and Rip felt famished, for he had not eaten breakfast. He grieved to give up his dog and gun. He dreaded to meet his wife, but it would not do to starve among the mountains. He shook his head, shouldered the rusty firelock, and, with a heart full of trouble and anxiety, turned his steps home. And so Rip awakens, bewildered, aching, alone. His gun is rusted, his dog is gone, and the world already seems unfamiliar. In our next episode, we'll follow Rip down the mountain, into a village that does not recognize him, into a future that has moved on. Because sometimes, when we let the world pass by, we do not wake up the same. Until next time, may we remember the names worth keeping. Thank you for listening to New American Mythos. If these stories have stirred something in you, one of the best ways to support the show is to join our growing community on Patreon. We've worked hard to provide some perks that we think will really be compelling. At the first tier, you'll receive early access to all episodes, plus 2 exclusive bonus episodes when the season concludes. At the second tier, you'll get a special gift in December, a free copy of this season's separate audiobook project, which is our modernized recording of Washington Irving's short novel, Old Christmas. This will be just in time for the Christmas holiday. And for our top-tier patrons, also in the beginning of December, you'll receive an early edition, signed, limited edition copy of the bound collection of Season 1 myths, a tangible piece of the world we're building together. Regular listeners will have to wait a little while until a non-limited version of this book becomes available for purchase later on. Your support keeps the lantern lit and ensures that these old stories can speak anew. Thank you for walking this road with us.